Morning everyone, welcome to Clarke Towers. I'm filming from the library today for the first lesson in Inspector Calls. Hope you're all okay at home. What we're going to do, as I emailed to your parents, is I'm going to do like a 15-20 minute video. We'll see how long they last, I've no idea. And in the video I might ask you to pause and complete a table or complete a task or whatever. And then we'll do some modelling of work on the board, particularly around exploding quotes, squeezing out as much as we can. We've got to remember those focuses on AO1, understanding the plot and the character and the ideas. AO2, the language. And I would say, actually, for A Christmas Carol, language is much easier than it is for Inspector Calls. So we'll have a look at the language in a little bit more detail. And then the AO3, the context, which is much more straightforward than any of the other texts. So AO3 is easier, AO2 a little bit harder for Inspector Calls. But I'll model it through, and hopefully by videoing some lessons, it'll be a little bit easier for you to understand, and I can explain it a little bit more thoroughly than just giving you sheets to do. So hopefully at this point, what you'll have done, you will have taken your copy of Inspector Calls like this, and you'll have annotated all of the questions in it. And we'll have a look at those when we get back to school. But if you've answered all of those questions and had a go and keep rereading the text, you'll have a good knowledge. That's a really good place to start from, and you'll be reasonably confident with the text. We only had, 3 or 4 lessons, didn't we, on Inspector Calls before the lockdown. But hopefully by rereading the text, answering those questions, you're a little bit more solid on the story. So that'll help with the AO1. But what we're going to look at today is mapping the characters. Now, in terms of the characters, we've got Mr. and Mrs. Burling, their daughter Sheila, son Eric, Sheila's fiance Gerald Croft, and Inspector Gould. It is possible you'll get a question on Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. She hasn't come up on the exam paper yet, but more likely you'll get a question on one of these characters. If it's about Eva and you've revised these characters, you can always look at what each of those has to say about Eva, because we never meet her, do we? So actually, a question about Eva you can do through what each of these has to say about Eva, which is plenty, because that's how we know about her. In the exam, you'll get a choice of questions actually, but no extract. So you've got to know a number of quotes, even more than you have to do for A Christmas Carol perhaps, which makes it a little bit more difficult, but the question choice allows you to think about which one's going to be a little bit easier for you. And usually you have one question about a character. How does Priestley present, I don't know, Mr. Burling as a community-minded man or whatever, or it might be about a theme. How is the theme of poverty presented? How is the theme of responsibility presented through Inspector Calls? And either way, if you revise the characters, you'll have an insight into the themes anyway. So we can look at Mr. Burling. If you've got a question on responsibility, he has a lot to say about responsibility. You could do a paragraph on Mrs. Burling and what she has to say on responsibility and so on. So that should make it a little bit easier by picking your question carefully. And if you focus your revision on the characters, then actually you can easily use bits of those characters for a theme question anyway. So that's the way I would organise it. So what we're going to do today is I want you to take a double page in your books, or if you work on computer, turn it landscape, that's the way, isn't it? Landscape, and create columns. Now what I want you to do is to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters down the left. Give yourself plenty of space. I've tacked up some mini whiteboards on the board, so I've not got a lot of space, but give yourself space so that you can write quotes in. You'll have about 4 or 5 lines, won't you, for each character if you spread it out. Now, what I want you to do is to do Socialist Capitalist, Act 1, Socialist Capitalist, Act 2, Socialist Capitalist, Act 3, because we're going to map which characters change over the course of the play. So actually, I've only got 3 of the columns. You're going to have an extra 4 columns. Socialist and Capitalist again, Socialist and Capitalist again. So it'll look like you've got Act 1 there for Socialist and Capitalist, and repeat that for Act 2, Act 3 across. I haven't got the room on the board to do that, but that's what I want you to do now. So if you pause the video and create that table. Okay, hopefully you've done that table now. Let's remind ourselves of what we mean by socialist and capitalist, socialism and capitalism. And I've done them deliberately in these two colours because, broadly speaking, they match the ideologies. Let's write that word on the board, actually. It doesn't look much like it, but that's an E. Ideology. And ideology is a thought process, your belief system. Okay, your ideology is what you believe is right for society, what your beliefs are about the world as a whole. So socialist and capitalist are two opposing ideologies. Now, I've done the red for socialism because, broadly speaking, that's what the political party Labour would stand for. And I've done blue for capitalist because that's, broadly speaking, what the Conservative Party stand for. Okay? Now, socialism, socialist, comes from the idea of social, being concerned for society. So a socialist would believe that we are all responsible for each other. So the rich in society should pay higher taxes, for instance, because we should have a pool of money for benefits for the NHS to help the poorer members of society. We're all in this together, community. Okay? A capitalist comes from the word capital. Capital in this case meaning money, wealth. And capitalists believe that a person has their right to make their own money and that society is a meritocracy. You get to the top on merit. So if you work harder, you deserve more money. If you earn more money, you get to keep that money for yourself and your family and can save for your future. And that everyone should look after themselves a little bit more. There's so much more to it than that. I could speak for hours on socialism and capitalism. But replay that section of it, check you understand, write yourself a definition, look back through your Inspector Calls books because we have got definitions of socialism and capitalism, and we've stuck some quotes from the play to demonstrate socialism and capitalism. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to track whether some of these characters change in their views or whether some of them stick to their views all along. Now, I would say 2 characters here change. The rest pretty much stick to their views. Okay? So, start to think now, which characters do you think change throughout the play and which characters actually stay the same? So, let's start with Mr. Burling. I don't think I'm giving too much away in saying that Mr. Burling is a capitalist. All right? Now, what we're going to do is for each of the acts, and I can't do it for all of them for you, you're going to do this bit on your own. So for each of the acts, you're going to come up with a quote that suggests he's a capitalist. And I've done one for you for Act 1. A man has to make his own way, look after himself. And that's in his massive speech, just as he's talking to Eric and to Gerald about his beliefs that a man has to look after himself. This is when he's interrupted by a sharp ring at the doorbell and the inspector calls and interrupts his capitalist thoughts. All right? Now, for each of those quotes, now you may not have space to do this on the table. You might have to do this on another page. But for each of the quotes that you pick, I want you to explode them, to squeeze as much as you possibly can. So we need to be thinking about AO1, AO2 and AO3. Let's start with AO1, our knowledge and understanding. So what we've got to do from this bit is get 3 layers of inference. Remember when we talked about our hand for our paragraphs, we want 1, 2, 3 layers of inference. Something about the language, something about the context, and then we link it to another part of the play, in this case. It's exactly the same way you'd write up your essays for this as you do for A Christmas Carol. All right? So, a man has to make his own way, look after himself. Let's model this together. Usually I'll be getting your ideas here, and I'm hoping that you're shouting ideas at the screen. I still can't hear them. So what I'll do is I'll model some ideas. Man has to make his own way, look after himself. Well, it's a capitalist belief, so let's link it to that. So we've linked already to the context, and we'll do context in green. It's a capitalist viewpoint. All right? Now, what else do we have to say about that? Well, what he believes is that the individual is important. He does talk about and your family too when you have one. So individual is important, as is your family. Okay? A man has to make his own way, look after himself. Notice that he talks about a man. So we're talking about a patriarchy. And remember as well, a patriarchy, just like it would be in A Christmas Carol, and certainly when we come on to look at Romeo and Juliet, we're looking at a patriarchy, the place in society where men are important. So here, a man has to make his own way, look after himself. It suggests the patriarchy, but it also suggests that it's a man's role to earn money. Okay, so there's a load of things that we're starting with already. We've got something on the context. It's a capitalist viewpoint. Say something about that. Why is it a capitalist viewpoint? Well, it's a capitalist viewpoint because he believes that a man's money goes back into his own benefit, into his family's benefit. We've got the individual is important, as is the family. We've got the patriarchy, the man's role to earn money. A man has to make his own way. Look at this bit, make his own way. What does that tell us? Well, it suggests to me that he believes that hard work ends up with rewards. Okay, now you might be sat there at your computer thinking, well, yeah, that sounds fair. Hard work does earn rewards. Well, it does, but let's compare some different jobs. Let's take an extreme, a footballer. Does a footballer really work several million times harder than a doctor? Does a doctor work much harder than a cleaner? Does a footballer work much harder than a cleaner? So much more so that they're earning 1,000,000 times more than a cleaner does. And when you start to ask those questions, you start to really think, actually, is that right? Is that right? I know people, for instance, to make ends meet, who are working 3 different jobs. They're cleaning during the day, they're doing bar work at night, and they're doing another cleaning job, for instance, at the weekend. So they're working 7 days a week, day and night, and just barely getting by. So capitalists believe that hard work ends up with the rewards. In actual fact, that's not necessarily the case, is it? We only have to look at the moment with lockdown, with the NHS, and look how hard nurses are working, and they're not massively well paid. And yet they're so crucial to society. But also think about the cleaners on the wards. They're having to go in and they're earning just above minimum wage, and yet they're putting themselves in danger's way. They're working exceptionally hard to keep the wards as safe as possible for everyone who goes in there. So just a few examples to really start to question whether Mr. Burling's belief is actually correct or not. Okay, now we've got our context. We've got 1, 2, 3 different interpretations. I hope you're shouting at the screen now that we need some sort of language. And we do. So, a man has to make his own way, look after himself. What sort of words are those? Well, they are pronouns. And more importantly, they are first person pronouns when you look at his own, and a reflexive, and it's that particular part, by the way, that's the first person. His is usually a third person pronoun, but his own reflects it back onto the first person, and it's a reflexive pronoun. You might have done those in French. Je me lève is a reflexive verb to get up. Oh, it's me lève. Me lève is that? Or lave is wash yourself. Me lève is to get up. So same sort of process. They're reflexive verbs, or in this case, a reflexive pronoun, himself. And what that does, it means that he is focusing on himself. He is self-absorbed. he's probably pretty selfish, we could conclude from that. So we're actually finding a language point and we're saying something about it. We're inferring from the language point there. So there's a little bit of an explosion of a quote about Mr. Burling. Now, good time to pause the video. I'm going to rub the board and you could copy that down on a different page, or if you've got space on your table, you could do that. All right? Okay. Now, these boards don't rub very well. Oh, what a mess. Right. Okay. Let's go into Act 3 for Mr. Burling. Okay, I've skipped Act 2. You can do that yourself. But if we go into Act 3 with Mr. Burling, you'll find that he says something that seems socialist. When the inspector is about to give his final speech, Burling actually wants to do something about Eva's death. And he says to the inspector, "I'd give thousands." Yes, thousands. Okay, I'd give thousands. Yes, thousands. Now it sounds like he's willing to give his money away, so it sounds like it's quite socialist. And you could argue that he does change briefly, but he changes too late. So that's the first thing. And actually, the inspector himself says, "You're helping at the wrong time, Mr. Burling." So his help is too late. We might also think about his motivation for trying to help at this point. What is Mr. Burling most concerned about? And again, I would ask that question in class. I would hope that what he's most concerned about, you'd be able to recognise. He's most concerned about status and avoiding a scandal. Okay, now if we were to look at the context, we would say that it's a capitalist point of view, even though it sounds socialist. Because of these reasons, because the help is too late, because he's concerned more about a scandal and how it looks on himself, it's not socialist at all. It's actually a capitalist viewpoint. Let's get a third interpretation. I'd give thousands, yes, thousands. How is Mr. Burling planning to help? Well, of course he's planning to help by thinking about money. Now, another word for money is capital. You throw money at a situation. And actually, Burling's solution is based around money. He believes money is the answer to everything. Now let's reflect at that moment what his role was in Eva Smith's suicide. Well, what did he not do? He didn't pay them a little bit more in their wages that would have helped them live. So actually, when the inspector tells him you're giving money at the wrong time, it's too late, he's absolutely right. Because if he'd give thousands now, why wasn't he proactive? Why didn't he give thousands when the workers were asking for it? It would have cost him less than the thousands and thousands that he's probably suggesting he would give now. Okay, so he believes that money is the answer to everything. He's only focused on money. He thinks about money, not about people. And he doesn't say, "I'm sorry, I regret what I did to Eva." No, he thinks about how money can solve it. So that's a really important point, and it's a capitalist viewpoint, even though it sounds socialist. It would have been more socialist if he'd given the money at the time and allowed them to have a fair wage. Let's think about language. We've got our context. We've got our three interpretations, Our language, well, the obvious thing to look at there is the repetition. And why is repetition used? Well, it's used in order to emphasise his belief in money. Emphasise is such an important word in literature analysis. And don't be afraid to use it fairly often. He emphasises, and what that basically means is Priestley is trying to draw us into a certain viewpoint. So he emphasises that Burling's view is that money is the answer to everything. Emphasis on money, which links to that. If we were to link that quote, we might link back to Act 1, where Mr. Burling refuses to give the money, and he says that they were asking for the earth, and the inspector turns back on him. It's better to ask for the earth than to have it. And that's the part in the play where you could best link. So, I'm guessing this is about 20 minutes long. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to do that sort of process for each of the characters, so you've got a detailed map. You might need to go on to the next few pages in order to really squeeze out the quotes that you can. And you've got some models. Hopefully that's a reminder of the sort of things that we were doing in class all the time. So, Mr. Burling, capitalist all the way through. Mrs. Burling, I think we probably agree, entirely the same. Sheila and Eric are the two characters who change for me. There's a hint in the first act that actually she does believe in people. She says, but they're not cheap labour, they're people. Now that sounds really socialist, but you might also think in Act 1 that the inspector tells her, you used your power as the daughter of an influential customer. Remember, Sheila has Eva sacked from her job just because she was in a furious temper. So I wouldn't be suggesting that Sheila was socialist all the way through. She wasn't. She might have had that in the back of her mind, but actually she's a capitalist to start with. She uses her power and the power that money gives her. Eric changes. Gerald, not convinced by Gerald. I think he's a capitalist all the way through. And then the inspector, you need to think about why the inspector's there. Most of the characters are capitalists all the way through. All of them start off as capitalist except for the inspector. And what's the purpose of the inspector? Well, his purpose is to give a socialist viewpoint in the play. Why does he give a socialist viewpoint? Because he's the view of J.B. Priestley himself. He is the playwright's voice through the play. And what Priestley is writing the play for, remember, is to suggest that after the Second World War, we need a new socialist society, and one which spawned the benefit system, the NHS, as two famous examples. Okay, hopefully you'll know what to do. Remember, you've now got my email address. Email me if there's any questions, but I look forward to seeing your work on this.